Israel says the first stage of its offensive into Gaza City has begun, despite international criticism. How long will it last? And where will Gazans go? We'll discuss that on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Well, please welcome back to Newscast, Jane Corbin, Panorama filmmaker extraordinaire who spent loads of time in the Middle East. Hello again, Jane.
Hello, Adam.
Thank you so much for doing our old newscast about the Oslo Peace Accords. People loved it, and it was amazing. And it was such good training for me, hearing all of that for covering the news now, because it does all echo still very loudly, doesn't it?
Well, it sort of all fits together in not a very happy way, actually, given where we're at now in the Middle East. But yeah, it was an absolute pleasure to do it and to look back with Lise over those times.
And it's still available on BBC Sounds. We're also joined by Jo Floto, who is actually the bureau chief for the BBC in the Middle East. So a very busy man. Hello, Jo.
Hey, how are you?
Yeah, great to speak to you. And great to speak to you actually on Newscast as opposed to listening to you on a Teams call in the office.
Well, that's true.
Jane, before we dive into the news, let's do a bit of geography first. Everyone today is talking about Gaza City. Where is Gaza City and how does it fit into Gaza, the territory?
Well, Gaza City is in the north, and as the name suggests, it is or was the major city in the Gaza Strip. And don't forget that the Gaza Strip is a small piece of land. It's only a few kilometres wide and about 30 to 40 long. So we're talking about a very small area anyway. Gaza City was the main population centre in the north. Now, after the 7th of October, when the war started, many people moved and were pushed south. But there have been various sort of peace deals along the way, deals to free hostages, and many moved back to Gaza City. So there are now a lot of people who've been up and down the Gaza Strip, a lot of civilians who are now back in Gaza City. And obviously this is the area now that is the focus of what's happening now with the new Israeli move to conquer the whole of Gaza, beginning with Gaza City.
Jo, just tell us what's happening militarily then at the moment.
Yeah, so we've had all this week actually increasing military activity on the outskirts of Gaza City. You've had artillery fire in the areas of Zaytun. You've had Israeli tanks moving into an area of Gaza called Sabra, which is sort of south of the city centre, and that's also pushed a lot of people out. It's also killed quite a lot of people out. And this is, we're told, that the kind of preliminary stages of what's going to be a big invasion, an occupation of Gaza City. The Israeli military and government have said what they intend to do is evacuate the city, tell all the civilians to leave, and then they're going to go in and fight Hamas until they're defeated. That's easier said than done, of course.
And Jane, just talking about the Israeli grand strategy here, how does what's happening today fit into what's potentially going to happen, and how does that fit into the whole thing?
Well, don't forget, it's not much less than 2 years now since October 7th, 2023, and we've had this war going on in Gaza to destroy Hamas, which is the stated aim of the government. Obviously, it hasn't destroyed Hamas yet because Hamas is still holding Israeli hostages. They're believed to be 20 still alive. So the government had tried to have or negotiate with Hamas. There were varying opinions as to how much Benjamin Netanyahu wanted to do a deal, but effectively that negotiation has been stuck since March. So for the last 5 months, not much has happened. Now, ironically, Hamas has come back to the negotiating table in the last couple of days with a deal which is essentially the same one as we had in March, which is to release hostages in 2 phases, 10 at a time, of the living hostages and some of the bodies, in return for a 60-day ceasefire. But in the meantime, the Israeli government has put forward its plan, which is it only wants to have the hostages released in one single tranche. And it believes that the only way to do that is to destroy Hamas. And that means occupying the whole of Gaza. Previously, they were occupying about 75%. But that means taking the whole of the Strip. And as Jo said, moving civilians out that are still in the north, which is essentially where they're focusing first of all. And presumably, going in really, really hard with all these battalions that they've got in the area.
And Jo, what do we know about what might happen next militarily? And also, is that just a threat as opposed to something that's actually going to happen?
Yeah, it could be both, actually, Adam. So we've had all week, and actually for quite some time, some very deliberate signalling from the Israeli government and military that they're preparing to go in. So we had earlier this week the drafting of another 50, 60,000 reservists, so that'll take a few weeks to play out. We've had today the military calling up hospitals and medical facilities in the north of the Gaza Strip saying it's time to leave. But if it happens, then they're going to have about 5 divisions of soldiers and tanks moving steadily into Gaza City. And as Jane has pointed out, there's a lot of people there who've been displaced before. So we think it's about 800,000 to 1 million people who've drifted back into Gaza City. And a lot of them are telling us they just don't want to leave. And some of them saying they can't leave. They don't have the energy, they don't have the calories, and they don't have the wherewithal to get to the south of Gaza. It's a little bit bigger than Jane said. It's about 30, 40 kilometres to get south to where the Israeli military want them to go. But there's no money, there's very little fuel, and people don't have literally enough calories in them at the moment to make that kind of journey on foot. So everyone is worried about the human suffering that an offensive will entail. The Israeli government is still maintaining the position, and the military, that this is where they're heading, this is what they want to do in order to get rid of Hamas.
Oh, Jo, I don't want to trivialize the situation, but it's as simple as like people just being too knackered from lack of food to be able to contemplate moving again. It's sort of as simple and as grim as that.
Well, it's not just knackered, it's a calorie deficit. The situation, although it's improved marginally in the last couple of weeks after sort of international outrage has pushed Israel to allow more aid in, you're still getting people who are very, very hungry, and malnutrition is a sort of slow burn. It catches up with people over a period of time. And so they might be getting a bit more food now, but it's going to take a while till people are strong enough in some circumstances to make that journey. You've also got the different circumstance to last year where people still had reserves of cash, savings, something to pay for black market food or to pay people to take them on trucks to the south, and that's just not an option for lots of people now because their reserves are gone, the cash is gone, and so people are very worried. And I mean, we've heard from people who have even said, actually, I don't care anymore. Like, I can't move anymore, and I'd rather die here than just suffer the humiliation and the exhaustion of moving to another part of Gaza City. And where am I supposed to go? And it's the middle of summer now. It is about 34 degrees, very, very humid. It's quite a journey, even at the best of times, and this is not the best of times.
And Jane, is there any sign that the Israelis are taking that sort of stuff into account? Because they basically just say to the people in Gaza, the places that they want to hit, get out.
Yeah, and I think BBC Verify has been doing some really interesting work in the last couple of days, showing how the Israeli military, they believe to be IDF because of the sheer number of trucks and the disposition, are already clearing out the displaced people's camps that have sprung up, as Jo said, around Gaza City because people have come back. They're being dismantled. We don't know what's happened to those people. And sure, I certainly know from the people I speak to in Gaza that people are literally just dropping on the street. I heard last week from a woman there that she helped a woman into the hospital who couldn't go any further and had no money and couldn't feed her children. And how are people like that going to move south with there's no fuel, there's no trucks, everybody's donkeys is basically it, with perhaps half a dozen children, and maybe the breadwinner in the family has already been killed because many men have obviously, when going to fetch aid, have become the victims of the violence that's happened around some of those aid centres. So I think it's, as Jo said, people are almost like they've lost the will to do whatever they need to do next to get out of danger in and around Gaza City.
And Jo, you mentioned the fact that Israel's calling up reservists, and we were talking about this on 5 Live earlier on this afternoon. It's interesting that so much of the Israeli military operation requires these part-time soldiers. And also, I just wonder, the Israeli society from which these part-time soldiers come, like how are people feeling about this next phase?
Yeah, so look, on the reservist front, I mean, that's how the Israeli military works. It has a large standing army. You've got a conscript army, so a section of society is forced to do 3 years for men, 2 years for women, and that supplies the bulk of the manpower for the Israeli army. But for anything big or important, they draft the reservists in, and for combat soldiers, anywhere up, I think it's 40 years old, you can be drafted in. And in this war, that is Israel's longest war now, some people have been drafted up 3 or 4 times, and this latest draft won't go down well because it's tough for families, it's tough for individuals. And if you've got your own business, for instance, you do get some money from the state, but if you've got a shop and there's no one there to open it, then you're not going to do very well. So you have a lot of fatigue. You've got a lot of anxiety as well about the hostages and about what's happening to them. And I think Israeli society has been pretty stuck for a while now, and about 60% of the population, the polling has been pretty consistent, want this war wound up. They want a deal done to finish the war and bring the hostages back. And we're seeing that now ramp up. So we had a very big protest in Tel Aviv last weekend on Sunday, 200,000, maybe 300,000 people out there calling for an end of the war. I think the interesting thing in recent weeks is that part of that protest is now not just let's get the hostages back and finish this war because we're tired of it. It's also let's just stop the war because it's getting too much. Too many people are dying. It's not great for Israel. It's not great for the future.
Yeah, and it's a very divided society, and the hostage families have consistently been protesting every Saturday since almost 2 years now. But they've been joined by many others and families of some of the soldiers who've died, and also those who don't want their sons and daughters called up again for the 3rd or 4th time. So I think we're seeing a bigger protest, but I think people realise now that from the start, the hostages were the key thing for most of the population. Release the hostages, wind up the war. But now the fear is that if this action goes ahead in Gaza City and in other parts of Gaza, with the army cracking down even more, so-called destroying Hamas, that it's the hostages who are really in the front line, because they are believed potentially to be either in the north or the middle of Gaza. And these are areas which the Israeli forces, the battalions, will move into. So the hostage families have reached the point, really. And obviously we've seen videos and pictures coming out recently of the emaciated state of the Israeli hostages, which have been released by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, these videos. So there is a real sort of sense that time is running out for the hostages. And this has provoked even more protest and division within Israeli society.
And Jo, I was really intrigued when you were saying on the radio earlier on, something I hadn't really thought about in all of this, the effect on the Israeli economy.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we had some very stark figures this week. The last quarter GDP figures, that's the sort of national wealth figures, had dropped by 3.5%. I mean, last year the economy in Israel grew by about 1%, but that was largely due to the amount of money the government was spending on the military. And this year we're starting to see that unwind, and it shrunk by 3.5% last quarter. And just this week, the government announced cuts across the board. Every single government department is going to have to take a 3.5% cut in its budget, and that's over and above cuts that we've already seen this year. So things are really quite painful for a lot of people, and they're starting to feel the pinch.
And Jane, I know you've got to go shortly to go and work on your big film you're doing about the special relationship, the diplomatic relationship between the UK and the US. What are some things about the big international activity around this conflict that we should be thinking about?
Well, obviously, the key thing is the continuing American support for Benjamin Netanyahu. I think people are trying to second guess at what point Trump would perhaps speak out against what the Israeli government were doing, or at least try to intervene in some way. And he was visibly moved when he was here a couple of weeks ago by the pictures of starving children in Gaza. And we did see beginning of perhaps this is going to change the American attitude. But we haven't really seen much since then. And of course, Ukraine is now filling the headlines and filling the time for Trump and Rubio on that sort of side of things. So internationally, in this country and in others, we've obviously seen the promise to recognise a Palestinian state in September at the UN unless Israel fulfills certain conditions. So, I think everybody's very engaged in this, but it doesn't seem like any of this is going to make the Israeli government feel any differently about this forthcoming Gaza incursion. And the UN Secretary General has spoken out against it as well in the last day, but it doesn't seem to have moved the dial at all.
And Joe, from where you're sitting, are there any other things other countries could do, buttons that they could push that would affect any kind of change in Israel?
No, the key country is the United States, and I think that's the only country that matters at the moment. Israel is feeling politically quite beleaguered and under siege. It's taken against the promise, as Jane has pointed out, of some countries to recognise a Palestinian state, and it's promised to retaliate against that. And we'll see what happens next month. But currently, a lot of people are looking to the White House to be the key factor here that pushes the Israeli Prime Minister into some kind of negotiation. So as we've said before, there is a deal on the table at the moment. We don't know what's in it, but we're told it's very, very similar to the one Israel agreed to just a few weeks ago, and Hamas didn't. And now Hamas have been pushed quite hard by the Egyptians and the Qataris into saying, look, come on, you've got to do a deal. There's so much suffering. You've got to end this war. And in the meantime, Israel has said, you know what, we're not interested in these partial deals. We don't want half of our hostages back. We want them all back, and we want Hamas disarmed. We want security control over Gaza, and we want someone else in charge that isn't Hamas or frankly, the Palestinian Authority. So that ironically, the sort of big comprehensive deal is what the rest of the world has been trying to get Israel to agree to, and it hasn't. So now there's a partial deal on the table. It would get sort of 10 live hostages out pretty well at the start of any ceasefire. I think the concern in the Israeli government is that would just give Hamas a chance to regroup. But at the same time, the problem is that the Israeli government, in particular Benjamin Netanyahu, doesn't want to publicly or otherwise negotiate a day after plan. Who's going to run Gaza? How do you replace Hamas? And all we're getting at the moment is slogans about defeating Hamas, but you can't really just carry on a war indefinitely until the last person gives up their weapon, because that just doesn't happen. Well, there's no example of that in history, apart from possibly the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, but that's not really a useful analogy here, because you need a political solution. So we're still waiting for the official government response to this deal that's on the table, would end the fighting for 60 days, would have a promise of negotiating for the future. You've got the rest of the region lined up, ready to recognise Israel if they haven't done already, ready to integrate Israel, but what they want in return is a Palestinian state. And Benjamin Netanyahu has spent his entire career fighting against that concept. He thinks it's dangerous for Israel, and so he's not going to accept it, and certainly not going to accept anything that smells of that when he's got two key members of his government coalition who will pull out and bring his government down, they say, if he concedes that much. So we're stuck at the moment. Now, that doesn't mean Netanyahu is a master politician. He can thread his way through this. But the thing that people are looking for is a nudge from America. And as Jane said, they are fully focused at the moment on Ukraine. Maybe when the focus turns away from there, they might have a look at what's going on here and push the Israeli government and Hamas, who are already there, into a ceasefire. But we just don't know at the moment. And in the meantime, in that vacuum, people are still getting killed, and the Israeli military is still preparing for what would be a colossal military operation. And with the best will in the world, it's going to cause a huge amount of suffering to people who are hungry at the moment and have suffered quite a lot over the last 22 months. And by the way, actually, the Israeli military is signalling that it's going to be very, very difficult. I think they're doing that deliberately to make this quite a big step should Benjamin Netanyahu say go for it. And they're talking about at least 100 casualties on their own side. I think they're trying to make it as unpalatable as possible while still doing their duty and planning for it. And as we're seeing at the moment, they're actually fighting to say this is the start of the process.
And Jane, in terms of the international reaction, there's a statement from lots of foreign ministers, including the UK today, about the situation in Gaza. But just before we started recording this episode, there was another statement from lots of foreign ministers about another issue, and it's Israeli settlements in East Jerusalem. And that has an impact on recognising a Palestinian state, whether you could ever have a Palestinian state in geographical terms.
Yeah, because the other big news in the last week or so from Israel is the decision to develop a massive settlement on a piece of land which is called E1. It's been there, it's been earmarked for many years, which would effectively not only cut the West Bank, the Palestinian West Bank, off from East Jerusalem, the Palestinian area of Jerusalem, but would also cut the North and the South West Bank in two. So that is very much the child, as it were, of one of the right-wing ministers that Jo has referred to, Bezalel Smotrich. He's got his way. The government has now said this will go ahead. We will build settlements. There are 3,700 Palestinians living in that patch of land. It's about 12 square kilometres. So that's going to make a massive difference. So yes, how can there be any state when you not only have Gaza that's not contiguous with the West Bank, you now have Gaza and two bits of the West Bank. So I think it's not looking optimistic at all. And many people believe that the two-state solution is just not going to happen for practical reasons as well as political ones.
And Jo, I don't want to make it about us as an organisation, but it is interesting to have you as the bureau chief on Newscast. I mean, I just wondered tell us about some of the challenges you guys have faced over the last couple of years. I mean, everyone is aware that there's no independent outside journalists allowed into Gaza. That's a huge challenge for telling the story in a clear and fair way. But I'm sure there's lots of other ones as well.
Yeah, look, I mean, the first thing is this is the longest conflict I can recall ever being locked out of. And I think it would have made a big difference for us to be in there reporting continuously. But I also don't want to give the impression that we don't know what's going on. You know, we had for quite a long time our own staff inside for the first part of the war, and then we managed to evacuate them. And since then, we have a team of very, very dedicated, trusted freelancers who every day are going out filming and interviewing people and telling us what's going on. We also have a sort of a vast network of people we're calling every day. So it's not as if we don't know what's going on, but I think the impact of it would have been greater if the people that you see on your TV screens and hear on your radio every day would have been there throughout the conflict. I don't think if international media had been there, it would have lasted this long, frankly. I mean, I don't want to really? Sort of give us overinflate our impact, but I think that's one of the reasons why we've been blocked from going in. But talking about the challenges, those guys, and we don't name them for their own safety, working so hard. But it's heartbreaking in the last month or so. They're just telling us some days that they've been so hungry that they can't work, and that's awful. That they're saying I'm just too dizzy, I'm too faint because we haven't had enough food. And a couple of them have ended up, getting medical treatment, and they're just getting rehydrated, but there isn't access to enough food. There hasn't been. It's starting to get a little bit better now, but that's a terrible thing for them to go through, and it gives you a measure of how scarce food have got. And at the same time, you've got a very concerted effort by Benjamin Netanyahu to say that we're making this all up, that the famine in Gaza is a lie. And he stood up last week at a press conference and said Israel has never restricted food into Gaza, which is a flat-out untruth. Because it closed the borders back in March. So, that's one of the big challenges. I think, it's also, this is a hugely divisive conflict because it's part of a culture war that actually has nothing to do with the Middle East a lot of the time. But people use where others stand on this conflict as a filter. Are you on my side or not? And I think that makes it even more visceral. It makes the emotions harder and higher, and it makes people less likely to listen to things that they don't like. And that, I think, for journalists is tough because it means that people turn against you quite a lot. But that doesn't mean we should stop doing our job.
Well, Jo, thank you very much for your time today.
Very welcome, Adam.
And Jane, I was going to ask you a big question about putting this in the historical context, but actually people can go back and listen to old newscasts. And actually, as I said at the start of this episode, those building blocks in the early 90s and the hope that there was then versus the misery that there is now, that tells the story, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, the real problem, as Jo outlined, is that the Israelis, Netanyahu, won't say what happens the day after. So there's no plan for what happens in Gaza. And the Palestinian Authority, who now the government on the West Bank, have been ruled out. So how can you create the possibility of a Palestinian state when Israel will not talk about what sort of government it will allow, where security stops, overarching security from Israel, and where Palestinian self-determination starts? So I think that's what I find so difficult, that all the hopes that there were in Oslo and succeeding years, it was up and down, but there was always hope. I find it very difficult to know where that hope is now, because we don't know how these various bits that are Palestine in waiting, if you like, how they could be put together, how they could be governed, let alone how we can come out of the terrible situation that civilians are in, the starvation, the mass killings, etc. I think it's very difficult, and I have to say I'm not very optimistic.
Well, it's been nice to catch up with you nonetheless. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm sorry to perhaps be rather down at this point.